mentioned in the introduction to the last section, you never want to shoot in for a takedown without setting it up. There are a couple of effective ways to do this. You can set up takedowns utilizing strikes, or you can set up a takedown immediately after evading one of your opponent's strikes. In this section, I focus on the latter. The goal with most of the following techniques is to drop your level as your opponent's strike comes at you, causing him to miss. Before he can pull his arm back into his stance, you shoot underneath his outstretched striking arm, penetrate past his defensive lines, and seize control of his legs. The most important thing to keep in mind when practicing these techniques is that your first goal is to evade your opponent's strike. If you begin thinking about executing the takedown too early, there is a good chance that you will eat a punch. It is also important not to create patterns. If you drop your level and shoot in for a takedown every time your opponent throws a punch, there is a good chance that he will fake a punch to get you to react. As you shoot in, he throws a counter strike, such as a knee to the face. Again, I have included the combinations that have worked best for me, but it is important that you experiment to find what works best for you. In this sequence, I demonstrate how to counter your opponent's cross with a double leg takedown when in opposite fighting stances. The instant my opponent steps forward and throws the cross, I immediately drop my level to evade the strike, drive off my lead leg, and shoot my weight forward. Next, I shift my weight onto my right knee and slide my rear leg forward into the outside of my opponent's rear leg. With all that momentum moving forward, it becomes very easy to rotate my body in a clockwise direction around my opponent's rear leg. This method of working around your opponent's body for the takedown is often referred to as turning the corner. To obtain control of his body and make the most of my positioning, I quickly wrap my right arm around the front of his legs and my left arm around the back of his legs. Before I can complete the takedown, I first need to secure proper head positioning. Having just shot in, my head is currently positioned to the outside of my opponent's body. Without wasting time, I quickly reposition it to the inside of his body so that my ear is pressed into his stomach. Once accomplished, I have rendered my opponent immobile. To put him on his back, I rotate my body in a clockwise direction, pull his legs into my chest, and drive him in the direction I just came from. Unable to step in any direction, my opponent has no choice but to collapse to the mat. As a rule of thumb, anytime you and your opponent are in opposite fighting stances, single leg finishes will be the easiest to execute, and when you are in the same fighting stances, double leg takedowns will be the easiest to execute. However, breaking that general rule and utilizing techniques such as the one shown here is an excellent way to catch your opponent off guard. In the previous sequence, I demonstrated how to duck underneath your opponent's cross, close the distance, and then turn the corner and complete a double leg takedown. This technique has the exact same setup, but when you tie up with your opponent, you are unable to reposition your head to the inside of his body. Although this head positioning makes it difficult to complete the takedown by driving into your opponent, it allows you to circle around behind his back. However, with your head momentarily positioned underneath your opponent's arm, it is important to make this transition quickly to avoid getting caught in a guillotine choke. Once you've circled around behind your opponent, press your chest into his back to limit his ability to scramble. Next, you must gain control of your opponent's hips. To accomplish this, I unwrap my right arm from around my opponent's waist and hook it up between his legs. With my left arm still wrapped around his left hip, this allows me to clasp my hands together over his left thigh. This grip gives me a lot of lifting power. To complete the takedown, I use my legs to lift his hips upwards and towards my body. As his legs move out from underneath of him, he falls to the mat. In this sequence, my opponent and I are in opposite fighting stances and he throws a jab. To evade his strike, I step my lead foot to the outside of his lead foot and slip my head to the outside of his arm. Before he can pull his arm back into his stance, I drop my level and shoot in for a modified double leg takedown. To accomplish this, I move my left arm in front of my opponent and wrap it around his right side.
At the same time, I drop my lead knee to the mat behind his legs and grab his rear foot with my right hand. To get the takedown, I rotate my body slightly in a clockwise direction and drive straight into him using my left arm. With my right arm blocking him from stepping back and re-establishing his balance, he has no choice but to fall to the mat.
In this sequence, I demonstrate a variation of a body lock takedown used frequently by wrestlers. Starting in an opposite fighting stance as my opponent, I drop my level to evade his cross. While his arm is still stretched out, I step my lead foot forward into the outside of his lead leg and drive forward. It is important to mention that I do not drop my lead knee to the mat as I shoot in. Since my goal is to tie him up in a body lock, I keep my elevation slightly higher. However, it is very important that I get my hips lower than my opponent's hips. Once my right foot touches down to the outside of my opponent's lead leg, I skip my rear foot forward. Once my rear foot lands, I step my right foot even deeper to the outside of my opponent's body. This inward charge is not done in steps, but rather one fluid motion. In order to be effective with body lock takedowns, you must close off all space between you and your opponent and achieve chest-on-chest contact. Having closed the distance, I keep my hips lower than my opponent's hips, wrap my arms tightly around his body, press my right ear tightly to his chest, and pull his hips into me. To get a takedown from this position, I have the option of rotating him in a clockwise direction and tripping him over my right leg, but instead I decide to use a slightly unorthodox technique and circle around his body in a counterclockwise direction. Continuing to pull his hips toward me during the rotation, my opponent loses his balance and collapses to the mat. One of the nice attributes about this technique is that it allows you to fall directly into the mount and begin your ground attack from a dominant position. In this sequence, I demonstrate how to block a rear overhand when in an opposite fighting stance as your opponent, and then transition into a takedown that's a cross between an inside leg trip and a leg throw. As my opponent throws the overhand, I elevate my left arm to prevent the strike from landing. Instead of retreating backwards, I immediately step my lead foot to the inside of my opponent's lead leg and wrap both of my arms underneath of his arms, establishing a double underhook body lock. Next, I step my rear foot up to my lead foot and then hook my lead leg around the inside of my opponent's lead leg. In an attempt to destroy his base and balance, I rip my right leg backward, pulling his leg with it. To counter my takedown attempt, he shifts his weight onto his posted leg. Although this makes it difficult for me to finish the inside trip, it allows me to execute a throw. To accomplish this, I keep my opponent's left leg elevated using my right leg so he is unable to replant his foot on the mat, hop on my posted left leg in a counterclockwise direction, and pull my opponent in the same direction using my body lock. With all of my opponent's weight already on his right leg, as he is forced to move more towards his right side, he loses balance and falls toward the mat. In this sequence, I demonstrate how to catch your opponent's rear, mid-level tie kick when in the same fighting stance, and then take him to the mat using an inside leg trip. It is important to mention that if you were in an opposite fighting stance, this technique would be used to catch his lead mid-level tie kick. The first step is to catch the kick. To accomplish this, I turn my body slightly in a clockwise direction so I don't absorb the impact with my ribs, and then drop my left arm to scoop up his leg. Once I have my hand around his leg, I pull his leg upward toward my armpit to disrupt his base and balance. There are many options you can utilize from this position, but here I chose to close the distance and execute an inside trip. I achieve this by slightly rotating my body in a counterclockwise direction, placing my right hand on his right shoulder, and hooking my right leg around the inside of his planted left leg. To send him to the mat, all I have to do is push on his shoulder with my hand and pull his grounded leg out from underneath him using my right leg. The most important part about this technique is immediately attacking with a takedown when you catch your opponent's leg. If you delay, he can throw punches into your face or employ a single leg defense. Personally, I like this technique because it puts your opponent on his back but leaves you standing, which gives you the choice of striking him while on your feet or working to pass his guard to assume a dominant ground position.